The morning of my father's funeral began the way so many hard days begin, quietly, with the kind of grey light that makes even familiar rooms look undecided about being rooms at all. Before we continue, please subscribe my channel for such more stories and let us know where you are listening in the comments. I buttoned a black jacket that didn't quite fit my shoulders anymore and watched the coffee drip the way I used to watch rain slip off the eaves of my father's workshop. I told myself to drink it, to eat something, to be practical in the bland, useful ways people always advise when grief is present and useless. I failed at all three. Grace drove us to the chapel because she didn't trust me to focus on stop signs, and I didn't argue. She has her mother's careful hands and my father's habit of checking the mirrors twice. I took comfort in both. Ash, willow and maple flamed across the hills in that stubborn October way, too bright for a day that ought to be dim. The sign outside St. Clement's read, Richard Harper, 1939-2024, in plastic letters arranged by someone who could never have known how heavy those dates feel when they belong to your blood. Inside, the chapel smelled of beeswax and old songbooks. The organist warmed up a hymn that had comforted too many people to still feel personal, and I stood near the last pew for a while, as if the extra distance might make the next hour any easier to inhabit. People filed in with the expressions of those who have practiced sympathy and were now here to perform it again. Old neighbors in jackets that didn't see sunlight often, men from the feed store, a nurse who had learned my father's dry humor during his final month and claimed it made her day. I shook hands and nodded, a wind-up figurine who knew his one trick and did it on cue. John arrived the way he arrives everywhere, late enough to be noticed, early enough to deny it, a half-smile already posed for sympathy and photographs. Melissa drifted by his side in a dress the color of polite secrets, her hand looped through his arm with the proprietary ease of a woman who had learned that possession can masquerade as devotion if you angle it toward the light. He hugged me as if we had never argued in our lives. From behind his cologne, I smelled the aftershave our father used to wear, and for a moment I was a boy again, waiting at the garage door for a ride to the hardware store, a ghost visiting a ghost. "David," he said, voice low and grave, like a man who had practiced for just this room, "you made it." "I live 20 minutes away, John," I said. "It wasn't a pilgrimage." He smiled as if I'd told a joke. Melissa's eyes flicked to Grace and then to my empty ring finger and made a quiet inventory that was almost audible. If she found me lacking, she kept it to herself. She usually did. We sat in the front row because I was the elder son and I hadn't yet surrendered the furniture arrangement of grief to anyone else. The casket rested under a spray of white lilies that would be brown at the edges by morning. The pastor spoke about Richard Harper in the tone of a man unwrapping a middle paragraph. Steady hands, honest work, a life that had warmed other lives. I tried to listen. Instead, I heard the sound of my father's planer working a stubborn board, the way he would mutter, "Come on now," as if wood could be encouraged by affection. I wondered whether he approved of the lilies. When it was time for eulogies, a woman I didn't recognize stood first and told a story about how my father once repaired her porch steps in a November sleet storm and refused payment because safety isn't billable. I could see him shrugging that off as unremarkable. A man from the Rotary Club spoke about service. The nurse said he made her laugh even when the O2 numbers were ugly. I watched my hands in my lap and thought of all the sentences I could say that no one else could. How he whistled off-key when he was nervous. How he apologized to trees before he trimmed them. How he kept a screw jar labeled Maisk that was both a joke and a life philosophy. John rose when the pastor nodded to the family. He squeezed my shoulder with performative affection and took his place at the lectern like a man receiving a promotion. He looked out over the pews, and I watched his face settle into the gravity he uses at charity dinners and annual meetings. This is what John does best. He tells a room what it wants to hear, or at least what it will not bother to challenge. "My father," he began, pausing just long enough to let the phrase gather sympathy around itself, "was a man of constancy. He believed in showing up, in being there." He looked down, then up again, eyes glistening in a way that would have impressed me if I hadn't known he learned the trick at 15 to avoid admitting a lie. He believed family is not what you say in speeches, it's what you do in the long quiet days when no one is applauding. He let that drop into the room like a coin in a well. People leaned in, he had them, and because he believed that, John continued, he valued those who were there, in the shop, on the land, at his side. Day after day, he didn't glance at me, which told me he wanted the glance imagined. There are those who drift away from family and then drift back when it's time to be seen. That's a human thing, I suppose. But in our house, presence mattered, duty mattered. A rustle moved through the pews like wind passing over a field. I felt Grace stiffen beside me before she remembered she was not the one allowed to stand. John smiled with practiced sorrow. Some of you may not know this, he said, but for years it was mostly me and Dad, keeping the business upright, keeping the home fires. Some people, he gestured vaguely toward the back, but the trajectory was mine, were strangers to that work. Stranger, the word landed with a metallic taste. My mouth went dry. I could feel Melissa's satisfaction from 10 feet away. A cat discovering the sunspot had returned to its favorite room. John leaned closer to the microphone, lowering his voice into the confidant register that makes ordinary lines sound like revelations. We loved him. We showed up. That's all. And I know he knew the difference. There it was, the embroidery finished, the stitch that makes a suit sit just so across the shoulders of a lie. I could have stood then. I could have told them about the winter mornings I changed his oxygen tubing at 3 a.m., about the paperwork maze I navigated while John networked over bourbons downtown, about the afternoons I spent sorting the mess of bolts in that Mitzig jar because his fingers shook too much to do it himself. I could have told them how it was me who found him on the workshop stool, his eyes still fixed on the plane of a cedar board as if carefulness could be willed into the heart. I could have said 1,000 small, unpolished things that are the actual architecture of love. I didn't. Instead, I watched John lower his head with a final show of contained grief and return to his seat to receive the murmured admiration of people who like their stories simple. He squeezed my shoulder again. "You okay?" he whispered. "I will be," I said, and for a moment I believed it was a promise to myself rather than a courtesy to him. The hymn that followed, "It is well with my soul," landed like a dare. I mouthed the words because that is what you do in rooms like this. Grace's hand found my forearm and stayed there, steadying us both. When the recessional finally began, people filed past the casket with the expressions of travelers passing a border they have crossed before. Some shook my hand and told me my father had been a good man, as if that were breaking news. A few avoided my eyes, the way you avoid puddles when you're wearing the wrong shoes. Outside, the air had sharpened. A line of cars assembled itself into a river headed for the cemetery. I stood on the chapel steps longer than I needed to, not ready to watch the final arithmetic of earth and wood. John did what John does, steered the living like a foreman, pointing, patting backs, promising to meet folks after at the hall. Melissa checked her reflection in a dark window and adjusted the corner of her grief. We buried him on the West Hill where the ground is stubborn in February and forgiving in October. The dirt made its thud, and I discovered that nothing in a man's life weighs more than the first shovel on his father's coffin. At the end, people drifted to their cars, grateful for the neatness of ritual. I stayed until the groundskeeper gave me the look men use when their kindness has an appointment with a lunch break. Grace guided me back to the truck, and we drove to the fellowship hall where potato salad proves itself immortal, and coffee is always either new or ancient. The reception became a museum of stories, everyone curating their best version of my father while balancing paper plates. I stood beside a table of deviled eggs and said thank you until the word stopped meaning anything. John basked like a man on his favorite stage, pulling people into small clusters where he could perform a private retelling of our family's history, volume adjusted to the listener's appetite for gossip. It happened quickly, the way little avalanches do. Someone asked me loudly, because compassion likes an audience, how long I had been back in town. I said I'd never left. John laughed and said something about David's wonder years, and the group laughed too, though most of them had never met me before today. Then an old friend of my father's asked about the business transition. "Will you be taking over operations, David?" he said, and John clapped him on the shoulder, interjected and said, "I've been running things for a while now, Bill. We'll keep it in the family." "In the family," he repeated and looked at me the way a man looks at furnishing he intends to move to the curb. I felt Grace's presence at my elbow like a brace. "Granddad trained Dad on every machine in that shop," she said, voice clear as a bell rung for sailors. "He taught me too." "Kids," Melissa said, with a smile that made the word sound like a diagnosis. "They're so sweet with their stories." I saw it then, not just the narrative John had built for the room, but the scaffolding behind it. The will had not yet been read. The estate attorney had scheduled that unpleasant choreography for Wednesday, but John already moved as if a signature had knighted him. He assumed I would do what I have too often done, keep the peace, carry the furniture, leave quietly when asked. "Excuse me," I said, and stepped away from the cluster before my mouth delivered a truth I couldn't afford to waste in a church basement. Out behind the hall, the maple trees held onto their leaves with theatrical stubbornness. I stood under one and breathed until my chest remembered how. The gravel lot was a field of small suns where the afternoon light caught glass. I thought about my father's hands, how they were nicked and scarred and somehow tender too, despite all they had pried and pounded. He had believed in the long, quiet work. He had believed, perhaps mistakenly, that his sons would meet each other in that quiet with something resembling mercy. Grace found me after a while. "Granddad would have hated that hymn," she said, and I almost laughed. He liked the one with the sailor metaphors. "He liked words that had done a day's work," I said. She looked up at me, eyes my mother's, thoughtful in a way that always surprises me and never should. "You don't have to let him say those things," she said, and didn't clarify which hymn she meant because she didn't need to. "Not today, not Wednesday, not ever again." "I know," I said, and realized I meant it as a plan rather than a comfort. When we drove away, the hill with my father under it grew small in the rear view, then disappeared. At the red light by the hardware store, I watched a man carry a sack of concrete to his truck and thought about weight, how some kinds teach your muscles to be useful and others just break you slower than you notice. Back at my house, the answering machine blinked with the patience of machines who know people need time. One message from the attorney's office, a reminder about Wednesday, a request that both brothers arrive on time, a neutral voice trying not to wade into the river it was about to ford. I walked into the workshop and stood by my father's bench, where the cup he kept pencils in had worn a circle into the wood. He had written measurements there in pencil, a ghost math of projects half finished and never started. I put my hand on the scarred surface and felt the echo of his knuckles. "Stranger," I said out loud, tasting the word until it told the truth. Not about me, but about the person who had said it. Something settled then, not my grief, which had made a camp and would stay as long as it liked, but my reluctance. Love is quiet, yes, but sometimes it needs a witness and a paper trail. If John wanted to make a performance of family, I would let him perform, in the one room where performance is sworn into fact. I turned off the light, locked the door and wrote Wednesday on the calendar, even though it was already there. The day had begun with plastic letters on a church sign. It ended with a plan.
The house felt cavernous after the funeral, not because it was large, but because absence has a way of enlarging every corner. I moved through the rooms the way one walks through a museum after hours, slowly, careful not to disturb what could not be replaced. My father's hat still hung on the peg by the door, brim bent from years of weather, as if he might reach for it on his way to the workshop. Grace busied herself in the kitchen, putting away dishes no one had asked her to clean. That was her way of fighting silence, giving her hands a task until the noise of grief dimmed. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the oak table where my father had once read the paper each morning, shaking his head at politicians and muttering about men who couldn't drive a nail straight. The chair groaned under my weight the way it had under his, and for a moment I felt him there. But John's voice still echoed louder than anything else. "Stranger." He had cast it like a stone across a lake, and the ripples were still spreading. I couldn't unhear the murmurs in the church basement, the knowing glances exchanged, the way Melissa's smirk had tightened into triumph. That single word had drawn a border between us, as if years of care and labor had been erased with 3 syllables. Later that night I walked into the workshop, the smell of cedar and machine oil rising to meet me like an old greeting. Dust lay thick on the planer, and shavings still curled in the corners where the broom hadn't reached. On the workbench sat the jar labeled Miss, the one my father had kept filled with screws, bolts and washers of every size. I tipped it gently, watching metal glint in the dim light, and remembered his voice, "Keep everything. You never know what will fit where." That was my father, resourceful, steady, unwilling to waste what could be useful. And I had been his shadow in that shop for years, learning not just the mechanics of wood, but the rhythm of patience. If anyone had been the stranger, it was John, who drifted in only when it suited him, who spent more hours in country clubs than in sawdust. Yet here we were, the world believing his version. Grace came to the doorway, arms folded. "You're thinking too loud again," she said softly. I managed to smile. "Your uncle knows how to work a crowd. He's always been better with words than with work. He's rewriting history," she said, stepping closer. "And people are letting him. Granddad wouldn't have wanted that." Her conviction startled me. She was young, but she saw more than I sometimes allowed myself to. "The will reading is Wednesday," I told her. "That's when the real story begins." But I wasn't as confident as I sounded. John had been circling my father's affairs for years, and Melissa had the kind of mind that turned whispers into contracts. If they had their hands on the estate, they'd shape the narrative to suit them. I sat on the stool my father had used in his last days, the cushion worn flat, the wood scarred by years of elbows and tools. "Your grandfather taught me everything here," I said, gesturing around the shop. "How to square a frame, how to listen for the grain in the wood, even how to fix a hinge with nothing but patience and a steady hand. He trusted me." Grace's eyes softened. "Then you need to prove it." Not to John, to everyone else. Her words landed heavier than I expected. Prove it. That was the only path left to show, with more than memory, that I had been the son my father leaned on when the weight grew too much. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake listening to the old house settle, each creak reminding me of years layered beneath the floorboards. Memories came unbidden, my father calling me to hold a beam steady, his hand firm on my shoulder after a job well done, the way he'd say, "This will outlast us both if we do it right." By dawn I knew one thing: John's word might sway a room, but the truth had its own endurance, and like the grain hidden beneath varnish, it only needed to be revealed. Wednesday would come. The will would be read. And in that room where signatures carried more weight than speeches, I would find out just how far John's performance had already reached. Wednesday arrived with the kind of brittle light that makes even familiar towns look like someone else's map. The air was sharp, cold enough to turn every breath into something visible, as though even oxygen had decided to bear witness. I woke before dawn, not because I needed to, but because sleep had grown restless, filled with my father's voice receding into silence and John's louder still. Grace had laid my suit out the night before, a quiet gesture that told me she worried I might show up in my workshop clothes. She wasn't wrong. The jacket felt stiff, a stranger on my shoulders. In the mirror, I hardly recognized myself. Lined face, eyes shadowed from nights too long, and something else, something harder, waiting just beneath the surface. The Harper estate attorney, Margaret Ellison, kept her office in an old converted bank on Main Street. The vault still stood in the back, its iron door a reminder that people once trusted steel more than signatures. I had known her for years. She had handled my father's contracts, settled disputes with suppliers, even helped draft the first will I remembered him making, back when John and I were still boys pretending to help in the shop. Grace insisted on coming with me. "Family means witnesses," she said, echoing a phrase my father used to mutter when dealing with customers who promised payment next week. I didn't argue. The truth is, I wanted her there, not just as support but as proof to myself that there were still Harpers who understood loyalty. John and Melissa arrived late, of course, as though punctuality was an insult to their status. John swept into the office with his usual charisma, greeting Margaret like an old friend. Melissa followed, draped in a grey coat trimmed with fur that didn't belong in a town like ours. Her perfume announced her before her voice did. "David," John said, as if surprised to see me, though we'd been invited by the same letter. "Glad you could make it." "I live here, John," I said, repeating the same words I'd given him at the funeral. They tasted no different this time. Margaret ushered us into the conference room, a long table under a brass light fixture, the kind that hummed faintly when too many bulbs were lit. Stacks of paper weighted neatly at one end, the weight of my father's legacy reduced to manila folders and rubber bands. She began with formality, reading the date of death, the state statutes, the legal preamble that sounded more like scripture than law. My eyes drifted to the framed photograph on the wall behind her desk, my father shaking hands with the mayor at a groundbreaking ceremony years ago, his smile broad, his eyes proud. John had been there that day too, lurking in the background of the newspaper photo, already angling himself into the frame of history. Margaret's voice steadied as she began reading the will itself. "To my elder son, David Harper, I leave." She paused as John shifted in his chair, adjusting his tie with a smirk that suggested he already knew the words. "I leave my personal effects, tools and workshop." The room tilted. Tools and workshop. That was it? The space where he had built his life, yes, but what of the land, the business, the accounts? "To my younger son, Jonathan Harper, I leave controlling interest in Harper & Sons Woodworks, as well as all associated accounts, properties and contracts." John exhaled softly, a man savoring a cigar. Melissa's lips curled in satisfaction. I felt Grace stiffen beside me. "That's not right," she whispered. I forced my jaw to unclench. "Margaret," I said carefully, "when was this will drafted?" She checked her notes. "March of this year, signed in my office, witnessed and notarized. March."
That was when my father had been weakest, when the oxygen tank hissed constantly at his bedside and his hands trembled too much to hold a pen steady. I remembered feeding him soup one afternoon, his breath ragged, and him saying, "We'll talk about the business later, David. You don't need to worry." Now I understood. He had been too frail to worry aloud. John leaned back, folding his hands behind his head. Dad knew who showed up. He wanted the business to stay with the one who carried it when he couldn't. I bit back the words that threatened to spill. He hadn't carried anything. Not once had he changed an oxygen tank or balanced an invoice past midnight. But in the sterile ink of the will, his version of reality had become binding. Margaret continued. There were small bequests, funds to the church, a scholarship fund, some land donated to the town. But the division was clear. John inherited the empire, I inherited the scraps. When she closed the folder, silence stretched heavy across the table. "Any questions?" she asked, her tone neutral but her eyes searching mine. "Yes," I said. "Did you watch him sign it?" "I did," she replied, though she hesitated, just enough to be noticed. He seemed tired. It took him longer than usual. Melissa assisted him with the papers. I turned to Melissa. "You helped him." She smiled smoothly. "He asked me to." His hand was unsteady. I simply guided the pages. Grace's hand gripped my arm under the table, nails pressing warning into skin. Margaret cleared her throat. "I understand this may be difficult, but the will is binding unless contested. You do have the right to challenge it, though that is a lengthy process." John stood, adjusting his jacket. "There's no need for drama. The will is clear. Dad trusted me, and I intend to honor his legacy. David, you can keep the workshop. I'm sure you'll be comfortable there. Comfortable, like a man patting a dog's head." Melissa rose beside him. "It's what Richard wanted, and really, David, you've never cared for the business side. This way everyone wins. Everyone, except the son who had sat by the bed, who had known the sound of his father's last breath." I rose slowly. "We'll see about that." John chuckled, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. "Of course we will." He left with Melissa, the scent of her perfume lingering like smoke after a fire. Grace turned to Margaret. "My grandfather would never have left everything to John, not after all my father did for him. Something isn't right." Margaret's eyes softened. "I can't speak to intent, only to the document. But if you believe there's cause, gather evidence. That's the only way. Evidence." The word echoed in the room. Paper, signatures, witnesses, proof stronger than John's performance. As Grace and I walked out into the bright, cold air, she asked quietly, "Do you believe it?" I looked at the folder in my hand, the weight of my inheritance measured in pages instead of trust. "I believe my father loved me," I said, "and I believe John has made a mistake thinking paper can erase that. Mistakes have a way of leaving trails." The sun broke through the clouds for a moment, catching on the courthouse windows across the street. Trails, I thought. All I needed to do was find them. The workshop had always been my sanctuary. Now it became my war room. After the will reading, I walked back into that familiar space with a different set of eyes. Where once I saw wood, tools and memory, I now saw questions. Questions in the grain of every beam, in the dust on every shelf. Questions about my father's intentions, about John's role in twisting them, and about the signatures Margaret swore she witnessed. Grace followed me inside, her expression hard in a way that belonged more to an adult than a girl in her 20s. She set her bag on the bench and pulled out a laptop, already preparing herself as if she were my second in command. "You know what we're looking for, don't you?" she asked. "Paper," I said. "Paper never lies. People do, but paper always leaves a trail." The ledgers were stored in a cabinet my father had built himself, their spines worn, pages yellowed from years of fingers tracing numbers. I lifted the oldest one, a thick book bound in leather so stiff it groaned as I opened it. The ink inside had faded to the color of weak tea, but every column stood proud and meticulous. My father had believed in honesty, not just as a virtue but as a way of life. Grace scrolled beside me, cross-referencing digital bank statements she'd pulled up with the old handwritten entries. "Granddad's handwriting was steady here," she murmured. "Look, 1978, 1985, 1999, it's the same flow." And then she stopped. I leaned over her shoulder. In March of this year, the same month the will had been signed, the handwriting faltered. The loops grew jagged, the numbers uncertain. And then tucked among the entries were notations in a completely different hand, sharp strokes, hurried figures. "John," I whispered. "Or Melissa." Grace compared the signatures against older ones. Granddad's hand shook at the end, but these aren't shakes. They're imitations. See how the R in Richard looks? He always looped it downward. These angle up. Whoever wrote this didn't know the difference. I sat back, heat rising in my chest. Forgery. That was the word clawing at the edge of my mind. As we dug deeper, the numbers began to speak. Money had been siphoned out of accounts in small, steady increments, never enough to trigger suspicion, but enough that over months, thousands had vanished. The withdrawals were disguised as vendor payments, signed off with initials that weren't my father's. Where did it go? Grace asked, scanning the columns. I pulled another ledger down, flipping to recent pages. A pattern emerged. Entries marked with the name Cedar and Pine Consulting. It wasn't a company I recognized, and I had spent enough time with my father to know every supplier, every customer. Grace opened a browser and typed quickly. Within minutes, she turned the screen toward me. Cedar and Pine Consulting, registered LLC. Guess who the managing partner is? I didn't need to guess. Melissa Harper, she said grimly. I closed my eyes. My father's legacy had been siphoned into a shell company run by my brother's wife, and somehow in his final days my father had been convinced or coerced into signing a will that handed John control of everything. This is fraud, I said, clear as daylight. Grace nodded. But fraud isn't enough. We need proof he didn't intend the will that way. Something more than handwriting quirks. Her words stung because they were true. Courts needed evidence, not suspicion. I could shout forgery until my throat bled, but without ironclad proof, John's story would stand. I pushed back from the table and paced the room. Your grandfather was a careful man. If he felt cornered, he would have left something. A note, a file, maybe even here in the shop. We searched for hours, behind shelves, under drawers, even in the rafters where he used to hide Christmas gifts. The dust gave up nothing but spider webs and old receipts. It wasn't until I pulled out his tool chest, a battered steel box with rust curling at the edges, that I found it. Tucked beneath the false bottom, where he used to hide cash for emergencies, lay a slim notebook. The leather was cracked, the edges frayed, but his handwriting on the first page was unmistakable. David, the note began, if you are reading this, I may already be gone, or too weak to say what needs saying. I know John and Melissa have been circling like hawks. They've spoken to me about transferring things, about simplifying the estate, but I do not trust their intentions. My throat tightened. Grace leaned in, her eyes wide. I want you to know, the note continued, that my wish is for you to carry on Harper and Sons. You are the one who has kept it alive, even when I was too tired. John has many strengths, but discipline is not among them. If he gains control, he will waste what generations built. I pray Margaret will listen if I cannot speak. Trust yourself. You know the truth. The words blurred as my eyes filled. My father had known. He had known and tried to protect me, even as his strength waned. Grace whispered, "This is it. This is what we needed." I closed the notebook gently, as if the paper were bone. It's a start, but it won't be enough on its own. John will say it's old, or forged, or that Dad changed his mind later. We need more. Bank records, witnesses, anything that ties Cedar and Pine directly to them. Grace squared her shoulders. Then we follow the trail. I looked around the shop, the dust motes drifting like tiny witnesses in the sunlight. My father had built more than furniture here. He had built trust, discipline, and a name that stood for honesty. John had twisted that name into a mask for theft. I placed the notebook back into the chest, locking it tight. They think paper makes them safe, I said, but paper cuts both ways, and this time it'll cut deep. Outside, the wind rattled the leaves, carrying the sound of autumn across the yard. I knew with sudden clarity that John's performance at the funeral had been only the opening act. The real play was happening now, in ledgers and contracts, in the places he thought no one would look. But I was looking, and I would not stop. Melissa Harper had always known how to turn a room in her direction. I remembered the first time John introduced her at a 4th of July picnic years ago. Elegant, polished, her laughter just a little too loud for sincerity. She had shaken my father's hand with both of hers, holding on a heartbeat longer than necessary, looking up at him as if he were the most fascinating man alive. Even then, something about her rang hollow, like a bell cast in cheap metal. Now, with my father gone, Melissa's polish had sharpened into something harder. At the funeral, she had hovered at John's elbow, every tilt of her head signaling support, every glance measuring who was watching. But it was at the will reading that her mask had slipped, just enough for me to glimpse the steel beneath.
She hadn't just been present, she had guided my father's failing hand. She had positioned herself like a shadow behind John's inheritance, and the ledger proved her name was etched into the fraud itself. The next day, Grace and I sat in the workshop, the notebook open between us, the pages heavy with my father's warning. "He called them hawks," I said quietly. He knew what they were circling for. Grace tapped the entry about Cedar and Pine Consulting. "This is Melissa's company. That's the thread. If we pull it, the whole thing might unravel." I nodded. "But first we need to understand her role. John may be the face, but Melissa is the architect." It wasn't difficult to confirm. I drove into town that afternoon, stopping at the courthouse where business licenses were filed. The clerk, a grey-haired woman who had known my father for decades, didn't bat an eye when I asked to see records. There it was in black and white: Cedar and Pine Consulting, LLC, registered 18 months ago, managing partner Melissa Harper, mailing address a P.O. box downtown. When I returned to the truck, the paper crackled in my hand like a verdict. Grace, waiting in the passenger seat, raised her eyebrows. "So she set it up before Granddad even declined." "Exactly," I said. "She was planning this long before the will. John might think he's the brains, but Melissa built the scaffolding." That evening, we attended a community dinner at the church hall, a gathering meant to honor my father's years of service. John, naturally, took center stage, greeting old family friends with his politician's handshake. Melissa floated beside him in a dark blue dress, her smile fixed, her laughter strategically deployed. I stayed near the edges, listening. It didn't take long to confirm my suspicions. When people spoke of my father's honesty, Melissa would lean in and say, "Yes, Richard valued tradition, but he also valued progress. John has that same vision." She turned every compliment to my father into a credential for John, rewriting his legacy sentence by sentence. At one point she cornered me near the punch table, her eyes cool despite her smile. "David, I hope you're not making this harder than it needs to be." "What's that supposed to mean?" I asked. She sipped from her glass, red nails catching the light. "Your father wanted stability. He trusted John to lead. Contesting the will, stirring up suspicion, it won't bring Richard back. It will only tarnish his memory." I studied her, the way her mask never cracked, even as she spoke lies. "Funny, my father always said tarnish only sticks when there's dirt underneath." Her eyes narrowed just slightly before the smile returned. "Be careful, David. Grief can make men say foolish things." She walked away before I could reply, her hand slipping into John's arm as she whispered something that made him laugh. But I saw the stiffness in her shoulders, the subtle tightening around her mouth. She was rattled. Later that night, Grace replayed the exchange in her mind. "She's afraid of you," she said. "She knows you've found something." "She should be," I answered, "but fear makes people reckless. If Melissa feels cornered, she'll try to tighten her grip. And when she does, she'll leave fingerprints." Over the next week, I began tracing Cedar and Pine's activity. Grace, with her fluency in digital searches, pulled up state filings, bank records and contracts. The company had billed Harper & Sons thousands of dollars for consulting services that never existed. Payments had flowed steadily, always just below the threshold that would trigger audits, and each one bore a signature, R. Harper. But when I compared the signatures to my father's true hand, the truth was undeniable. The forgeries were clumsy, the pressure uneven, the slant inconsistent. Melissa had tried to wear his handwriting like a costume, but she hadn't studied it long enough to fit the part. The mask was cracking. One night, sitting at the kitchen table, Grace leaned forward, eyes bright. "We have enough to build a case, the fraudulent payments, the shell company, the handwriting inconsistencies. If we bring this to Margaret, she can take it to court." I hesitated. "John will fight. Melissa will twist every word. They'll claim Dad wanted it this way, that he blessed the consulting. They'll smear me as the bitter son trying to undo my father's wishes. Then we prove otherwise," Grace said firmly. "We use their own greed against them." Her conviction gave me pause. She had inherited my father's steel more than I realized. I closed the ledger slowly, the pages whispering like witnesses waiting to testify. The mask is slipping, and when it falls, everyone will see what's underneath. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, a warning and a promise all at once. Melissa Harper had built her empire on deception, believing no one would look too closely. But I was looking, and soon the world would see her for what she truly was. The shop had always been my father's world, but the attic above the house that was his vault. He never threw much away, and over the years it had become a jumble of boxes, trunks and dust, like layers of history piled on top of each other. When Grace suggested we look there, I almost dismissed the idea, but she had her grandfather's intuition, and I'd learned not to ignore it. It was a grey Saturday morning when we pulled down the folding ladder and climbed into the stale air. Dust motes swirled like spirits in the thin light filtering through a small round window. Grace tied her hair back, tugged on a pair of gloves, and started moving boxes with a determination that belonged less to curiosity and more to mission. For a while it was nothing but photo albums, rusted tools and old Christmas decorations. Then at the back corner, beneath a stack of crates marked invoices, Grace found a small trunk. It was locked, the metal tarnished, the key long gone. She looked at me, eyes alight. "This one feels different." I carried it down to the workbench, fetched a flathead screwdriver, and with a careful twist, the lock gave way. Inside lay neat bundles of envelopes, tied with string, each one labeled with a year in my father's steady script. Grace untied the bundle marked 2023. The letters inside were addressed to Margaret Ellison, our family attorney. They were drafts, unsent. Unsigned copies my father must have written in preparation for final versions. My hands trembled as I unfolded the first. "Dear Margaret," it read, "I want to make clear my intentions regarding Harper and Sons. My elder son David has been the one at my side through every difficulty. It is my wish that he lead the business after I am gone. John is dear to me, but his talents lie elsewhere. I fear giving him control would undo what I've built." I sat back, heart pounding. Grace pressed her lips together, fighting emotion. "There are more," she whispered. We read them one by one. In letter after letter, my father repeated the same wish, that I inherit the business, that John not be burdened with responsibilities he had never shouldered, that the Harper name remain a symbol of integrity. Some drafts were heavily edited, with words crossed out, new sentences scribbled in the margins. Others were clean, ready to be mailed. But then came a letter dated late March, the same month the will had been signed. This one was different. "Margaret," it began, "I feel pressure from John and Melissa. They are insistent about streamlining the estate. My health makes it difficult to argue. I fear they may persuade you of things that are not my choice. Please remember my true wish. David is to continue Harper and Sons. Trust him above all." Grace set the paper down slowly, her eyes fierce. He knew they were circling him. The air in the workshop felt heavier, as though my father himself were standing there, urging us onward. I folded the letters carefully, my throat tight. "These are drafts," I said, "not official documents. John will claim they were abandoned, that Dad changed his mind. But they show intent," Grace countered. "They prove he was worried. They prove Melissa was involved." Her words struck like a hammer. The notebook from the toolbox had been his warning. These letters were his testimony. We sorted through more boxes, uncovering additional ledgers and receipts. Among them was a file marked vendors, stuffed with invoices from Cedar and Pine Consulting. The amounts matched the suspicious withdrawals. Tucked inside was a note in my father's hand. "Not sure what this is. Ask John." It was proof he hadn't authorized the payments, proof he had doubted them. That evening, Grace spread the documents across the dining table like puzzle pieces. She highlighted connections, cross-referenced dates, and built a timeline that revealed a pattern of manipulation. "Granddad suspected fraud months before the will," she said. "He tried to warn Margaret. He left breadcrumbs. He knew someone would find them." I stared at the papers, the ink, the handwriting that was as familiar to me as my own. For years, I had believed my father was a man of few words. But here, in these drafts and notes, he spoke louder than John ever could. "This is more than evidence," I said softly. "It's a map he left for us to follow." Grace looked at me across the table, her eyes steady. "Then we follow it all the way to the end." Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. The night felt watchful, as though the world itself leaned closer to witness. John and Melissa believed they had silenced my father with forged signatures and manipulated papers, but he had found his own way to speak, even from the grave, and his voice, captured in ink and draft, would be the blade that cut through their lies. I leaned back, exhaustion pressing on my bones, but resolve burning brighter than ever. "They wanted to rewrite history," I murmured, "but history has its own pen, and this time it's in our hands." The deeper Grace and I traced the trail, the clearer it became. John and Melissa had not simply taken advantage of my father's weakness. They had engineered an entire story, thread by thread, until the web looked like truth. And the more I examined it, the more I realized just how carefully they had planned every move. Grace spread the papers across the workshop bench, as if laying out a crime scene. "Look at the dates," she said, circling entries with a red pen. "Every suspicious withdrawal, every cedar and pine invoice, it all ramps up right after Grandad's health started declining. They timed this to the week." I leaned over her shoulder, the smell of pencil shavings and old paper grounding me in a place that was beginning to feel less like sanctuary and more like battlefield headquarters. "They were patient," I said. "They waited until he couldn't push back. Then they swooped in." The will itself now looked like the centerpiece of a larger scheme. John hadn't just convinced my father to sign. Melissa had been the architect, drafting documents, guiding his hand, ensuring Margaret saw only what they wanted her to. And while John delivered his performance at the funeral, Melissa had been the one pulling strings, tightening knots around every thread of the Harper legacy. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the dining table long after Grace had gone to bed, the lamplight pooling over ledgers and letters. My father's words echoed in my head. "Trust yourself. You know the truth." But truth was fragile when it was just words against signatures. Courts respected ink, people respected performances, and John was better at both than I'd ever be. The next morning, I walked into town to clear my head. Main Street bustled with the ordinary rhythm of life, kids running out of the bakery with muffins, old men playing checkers outside the barber shop, the smell of coffee drifting from the diner. It should have felt comforting, but all I could see were the faces of people who might already believe John's story. At the diner, I ran into Bill, an old friend of my father's. He shook my hand warmly, but then his voice dropped. "Heard you're having some trouble with John. David, you know your dad always said John had a gift for business. Maybe it's best to let him carry things now." The words stung. John's lie was spreading, seeping into the town's memory, like ink into water. When I got home, Grace was waiting with a new discovery. "Dad, I pulled some corporate filings online. Cedar and Pine isn't just Melissa. John is listed as a silent partner." I stared at the document she printed out. There it was, his name, clear as day. He had hidden behind Melissa's title, but legally, he was tied to the fraud. "This is it," I said. "This connects them both. If we can prove Cedar and Pine was nothing but a funnel for stolen money, John won't be able to deny it." But Grace shook her head. "It's not enough. They'll say it was legitimate consulting. We need something bigger, something that shows intent." Her words settled heavy in the room. Intent. That was the key. Not just that money moved, but that it was stolen. Not just that signatures were shaky, but that they were forged. The breakthrough came later that week, when I stopped by Margaret's office to discuss my father's letters. She listened carefully, her eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. When I laid the drafts on her desk, she studied them for a long time. "These are powerful," she said, "but as you know, drafts are not binding." However, she opened her file drawer and pulled out a thin envelope. "There's something you should see." Inside was a letter dated just weeks before my father's death. It was written to Margaret, signed shakily but unmistakably in his hand. In it, he expressed confusion about new documents John and Melissa had presented him, warning that he felt pressured. "If these papers conflict with what I've told you before," he wrote, "trust my earlier wishes." Margaret looked at me. "I didn't show this at the reading because it wasn't part of the will, but it supports your claim." He had doubts. My chest tightened. My father had been fighting even in his final days, leaving crumbs for me to follow. Walking back through town, the world felt different. Every brick and storefront seemed to whisper of my father's life, his honesty, his patience. And now I carried proof that John and Melissa's empire was nothing but scaffolding built on lies. That night, I gathered Grace at the table. We laid everything out: ledgers, Cedar and Pine filings, drafts, Margaret's letter. Piece by piece, the web revealed itself. John and Melissa had forged documents, siphoned money, and manipulated a dying man's trust. Grace looked at me, determination in her eyes. "We have the truth. Now we need to decide. Do we fight them quietly, or do we tear off the mask in front of everyone?" I thought of the funeral, of John's hand on my shoulder, of Melissa's warning smile. I thought of my father's steady voice in the letters, his plea to trust myself. "We tear it off," I said, "in front of everyone. No more shadows." For the first time in weeks, I felt something close to peace. The web of lies was vast, but webs are fragile when you know where to strike. And soon, John and Melissa would learn that the same threads they used to bind others could also be used to unravel themselves. The courthouse in our county wasn't a grand building. It wasn't marble columns or polished brass. It was brick and wood, a place where farmers once argued over land boundaries and small-town thieves were scolded by judges who still believed shame could set a man straight. But that morning, as I walked up the worn stone steps with Grace at my side, it felt like the weight of generations pressed on those doors. John and Melissa were already there. He wore a tailored suit that looked borrowed from a world larger than ours, his tie perfectly knotted. Melissa was radiant in her way, every detail curated to project respectability. They looked like winners before the contest began. I suppose that was the point. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with curiosity. Neighbors, old friends of my father, even men from the feed store had come to watch. Small towns don't see inheritance battles every day, and certainly not when the Harpers were involved. My name had always meant something here, so had my father's, and now John was trying to bend that meaning into his own shape. Margaret met us near the bench, her file thick with documents we'd gathered, the ledger entries, the drafts, the letter my father had written in his final weeks. "We have a case," she whispered, "but remember, the law isn't about who's right. It's about what you can prove." The judge entered, a stout man named Wallace, who had known my father since they were boys. That gave me some hope, but he was not a man who let history cloud judgment. He adjusted his glasses, looked out over the room, and called us to order. John's attorney, slick and polished, began the argument. He painted John as the dutiful son, the one who kept Harper and Sons alive, while I wandered from responsibility. He waved the signed will like a flag, repeating that my father's wishes were clear, binding and deliberate. Melissa sat behind him, every nod and glance calculated. At one point she dabbed at her eye with a handkerchief, and I nearly laughed at the performance. Then it was Margaret's turn. She stood with calm authority and laid out the evidence. The suspicious payments, the shell company, Melissa's name on the filings, my father's drafts, pages and pages where he expressed doubt, where he named me as his true successor. And then she handed the judge the final letter, the one where my father warned of pressure and insisted that earlier instructions be trusted if contradictions arose. The courtroom shifted. Murmurs rippled through the spectators. For the first time, John's smile faltered. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Harper," he said, looking at John, "do you deny that Cedar and Pine Consulting is operated by your wife?" John's jaw tightened. "It's a legitimate company, Your Honor. We advised my father on streamlining the business. He approved every payment." "Approved," Margaret said sharply, "or signed under duress when he was too weak to argue?" She laid down copies of the forgeries, the handwriting jagged and inconsistent. "These signatures are not Richard Harper's hand. Anyone who knew him can see that." The judge studied the pages for a long moment, then turned to Melissa. "Mrs. Harper, did you assist Richard Harper in signing documents?" Her mask slipped just slightly. "He asked for help. His hands were unsteady." "Did you guide the pen?" A pause. "Too long." "Yes," she admitted finally, "but only at his request." The courtroom erupted in whispers. To guide a dying man's hand. To some it might sound like kindness, but to others it was manipulation in plain sight. I felt Grace's hand squeeze my arm. Her eyes shone, not with fear but with resolve. When it was my turn to speak, I rose slowly. My voice shook at first, but steadied as I went on. I told them about the nights I sat by my father's bed, changing oxygen tanks, reading him the paper when his eyes were too tired. I told them about the mornings in the workshop, the lessons in patience and honesty, the jar of miscellaneous screws that he insisted was more valuable than gold because it represented a lifetime of persistence. And then I read aloud from the notebook he had hidden in the toolbox. His own words, "It is my wish that David continue Harper and Sons, trust him above all." The silence after I finished was the kind that lingers, heavy, undeniable. John stood to counter, his voice sharp. "Your Honor, these are sentimental scraps. The will is the law. My father signed it. All of this," he gestured at me, at Grace, at the papers, "is just bitterness. David resents that I carried the weight he couldn't." For a moment, it almost sounded convincing. Almost. But then Margaret rose again. Calm, deliberate, she held up the filings that tied John himself to Cedar and Pine. Bitterness doesn't siphon thousands of dollars from company accounts. Lies do. The judge's gavel came down sharply. Enough. His voice was steady but edged. "I will review this evidence carefully, but one thing is already clear. There are serious questions about the validity of this will and about the conduct of those who benefited from it."
John's face darkened, Melissa's lips pressed thin. The storm had broken over them, and for the first time they looked like people who realized their umbrella was made of paper. As we left the courthouse, the autumn sun struck the bricks, bright and unyielding. Neighbors approached quietly, offering nods, even whispered support. The tide was turning. Grace walked beside me, her chin high. "They can't hide anymore," she said. "No," I agreed. "The web's unraveling, and once it's gone, everyone will see exactly who's been spinning it." By the time the second hearing was scheduled, the town was humming with whispers. In diners and hardware stores, on porches and at gas stations, people were choosing sides. For years, John had cultivated the image of a charming businessman, the son who knew how to move in the right circles. But now, cracks were showing, and small-town ears are sharp at catching the sound of splintering reputations. Grace and I prepared in silence most nights, spreading papers across the table until the wood was invisible beneath layers of ink and truth. Every ledger entry, every forged signature, every draft letter was a piece of the puzzle. What had once looked like scattered crumbs now formed a trail, clear enough for even the most skeptical to follow. Still, John wasn't finished. He moved through town with a smile plastered across his face, shaking hands, buying rounds at the bar, insisting the whole thing was a misunderstanding stirred up by grief. Melissa played her part with equal precision, dropping hints that I was unstable, that grief had made me desperate, that my daughter was manipulating me with wild theories. It was a performance, and in a town like ours, performances often carried as much weight as facts. The breaking point came when a man named Carter, one of my father's oldest employees, came knocking at my door. His cap was in his hands, his eyes hesitant. "David," he said, voice gravelly, "there's something you need to see." He handed me a folder, worn and creased. Inside were copies of invoices he had kept for his own records, payments supposedly made to Cedar and Pine Consulting. "Thing is," Carter said, "we never saw anyone from Cedar and Pine, not once. Your father asked me about them, but when I said I didn't know who they were, he just sighed. That was back in March. Proof. A witness. A man who had stood beside my father long enough to know when something smelled wrong. When I showed Grace, her eyes lit with fire. "This is it, Dad. This ties everything together. Fraudulent invoices, no real services, a shell company, Melissa's name, John's signature. They can't dance around this anymore." The second hearing arrived on a rain-slick morning. The courthouse smelled of damp coats and old paper. Judge Wallace sat heavier this time, his eyes sharper, his patience thinner. He had read the filings, the letters, the notes. Now he wanted answers. Margaret presented Carter's testimony first. The old man spoke plainly, without theatrics. Richard Harper didn't trust those payments. He asked me more than once who Cedar and Pine was. I told him I didn't know. But I'll tell you this, he didn't sign off on those invoices. That wasn't his way. The room stirred. John's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his clients. Then Margaret produced the corporate filings again. Melissa Harper is listed as managing partner of Cedar and Pine Consulting. Jonathan Harper is listed as a silent partner. Both profited directly from fraudulent payments siphoned from Harper and Sons accounts. That is theft, plain and simple. Melissa rose suddenly, her voice shrill. "Those payments were for legitimate consultation. Richard agreed to them. Then where are the reports?" Margaret asked coolly. "Where are the emails, the plans, the deliverables?" "There is nothing. Not a scrap of paper, not a single record, just empty invoices and your names." The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel. John shifted in his chair, his face pale beneath the courtroom lights. When he finally spoke, it wasn't with confidence, but with a snap of frustration. "Dad wanted me to lead. He knew David couldn't handle it. He said it himself." Margaret turned to me, and I rose with the notebook. I read my father's words again, the ones carved in his own hand, steady even through pain. "It is my wish that David continue Harper and Sons. Trust him above all." The judge leaned forward. "Jonathan Harper, you claim your father said otherwise. Do you have any written statement, any recorded words, any evidence to support that claim?" John's mouth opened, but no sound came. Melissa looked away, her mask cracking into something raw, angrier. The judge's gavel came down. "I have seen enough. This court will not tolerate manipulation of a dying man's trust. The validity of this will is under grave suspicion, and until further review, control of Harper and Sons is to be frozen." No transactions, no management decisions, without this court's oversight. The room erupted, gasps, murmurs, the rustle of scandal weaving through the benches. For the first time, John and Melissa looked cornered, stripped of the control they had wielded so smugly. As Grace and I walked out into the rain, she tilted her face to the sky, letting the drops wash across her cheeks. "We did it," she said softly. "We broke their story." I nodded, though I knew the war wasn't over. The court had frozen the business, but the final verdict still loomed. John and Melissa would fight harder now, desperate to salvage the empire of lies they had built. But the cracks were spreading. "They built their house on sand," I said quietly, "and the tide just came in." Grace smiled, weary but resolute. "Then let's make sure the whole thing washes away." The final hearing came with a weight in the air you could almost taste. Weeks had passed since Judge Wallace froze Harper and Sons, and in that time John and Melissa had scrambled like cornered foxes. Their lawyers filed motions, their allies whispered in town, and their smiles grew thinner with every passing day. The town wasn't blind anymore. People had seen too much. I walked up the courthouse steps with Grace at my side. She held a folder under her arm, her eyes steady, her chin high. She had become my anchor in all this, a reminder that what we fought for wasn't just money or property, but truth, dignity, and the name my father had built with his own hands. Inside, the benches were packed again. I saw Carter, my father's old friend, sitting in the back row. Neighbors who had doubted me at first now nodded in quiet solidarity. Even Margaret, usually calm and reserved, wore a look of quiet determination. She had smelled blood in the water and knew the sharks were circling the wrong side now. John and Melissa sat at the defense table. He looked worn, his charm dulled, his posture rigid. Melissa was paler than I had ever seen her, her eyes darting like a trapped bird. Their empire was collapsing, and they knew it. Judge Wallace opened proceedings with a measured voice. "We are here to determine the validity of Richard Harper's final will and the rightful stewardship of Harper and Sons." John's lawyer rose first, repeating the same tired refrain, that the will was clear, that Richard's signature bound his wishes, that my claims were nothing more than the bitterness of an overlooked son. It was polished, rehearsed, but hollow. Then Margaret stood. She didn't raise her voice, but every word carried like a hammer on stone. She laid out the ledgers, the fraudulent invoices, the shell company tied directly to Melissa. She presented Carter's testimony again, showing that Richard himself had doubted Cedar and Pine. She read from the drafts, the letters, and finally the notebook Richard had hidden away, his true voice etched in ink. And then came Grace. She stood at the witness stand, her hand steady, her voice unwavering. She told the court about her grandfather's lessons, how he spoke of honesty as the cornerstone of the Harper name. She told them how she had found the drafts in the attic, how her grandfather had left a trail because he knew someone would need to uncover the truth. Her voice broke only once, when she said, "My grandfather trusted my father. He wanted him to carry on what he built." John and Melissa tried to erase that, but you can't erase love, or loyalty, or truth. Not with forged signatures, not with lies. The silence afterward was thicker than any argument. Even the judge leaned back, his eyes heavy with thought. Finally, Judge Wallace spoke. "The evidence is overwhelming. Richard Harper's intent was clear in his drafts, his letters, and his actions. The will presented by Jonathan Harper and Melissa Harper shows signs of manipulation and cannot be upheld as valid. Control of Harper and Sons is hereby granted to David Harper, as was Richard's true wish." The gavel struck. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a verdict carried on thunder. John shot to his feet, his face red. "This is a farce. He never wanted you to have it." But Melissa didn't join him. She sat frozen, staring at the floor, her mask shattered. She knew it was over. I turned, meeting John's furious gaze with calm steadiness. "You called me a stranger at my father's funeral," I said quietly, so only he could hear. "But today the truth proved otherwise. You're the one who doesn't belong." The deputies moved in as the judge ordered an investigation into Cedar and Pine for fraud. John raged, Melissa wept silently, and the town watched as their masks slipped for good. Outside the courthouse, the sun broke through grey clouds. Grace stood beside me, her hand slipping into mine. Neighbors gathered, some offering handshakes, others simply nodding. They had seen the truth unfold, piece by piece, and the Harper name was restored. I looked toward the horizon, where the fields stretched out under golden light. "It's ours now," I said softly. "Not just the business, the legacy, the truth." Grace smiled, her eyes shining. Granddad would be proud. For the first time in months, I believed it. My father's voice no longer echoed as a plea, but as a presence, steady and certain. The lies had fallen, justice had been served, and the Harper name, once tarnished, shone again like polished oak.